This is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News from Marrakech, Morocco, and COP22. I'm here today with Kevin Anderson, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the Universities of Uppsala in Sweden and Manchester, and also the Deputy Director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research. Thank you very much for joining us today, Kevin.
Good afternoon.
Now, the first question I have for you is more of a logistical one than anything, and that is, why are you not in Marrakech at COP22 this year?
Well, I did think about going, but I'm currently based in Sweden, and it takes me 3 days to get there because I wouldn't fly. I'd have to go by train and then ferry and then another train. And so I did think about going, but I couldn't really justify the time to attend. So I thought what I would try to do would be to engage virtually. So I've been listening to some of the live streams and been contributing through sort of virtual means rather than actually physically being there.
And I understand you've been avoiding air travel for quite some time. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've not flown now since I think 2004. So yeah, I have actively tried to avoid flying. That has meant sometimes that I've not been able to attend things that I would otherwise perhaps attend. But there are always plenty of other opportunities for me to get to events or to engage virtually. I also think it's really important that those of us who work on climate change, who recognise the challenges that we face, try to demonstrate that in our own world, in the academic world, for instance, where I work, that we can actually carry on doing good quality research, but with much lower emissions. If we can't, as a sector, demonstrate that, why should we expect any other sector to think that it is viable for them to make the changes? So I think by trying to set an example, that helps to catalyse a wider change in society.
Am I correct that it's currently anticipated that 2016 will surpass, or is anticipated to surpass, the record set in 2015 by a significant margin?
Yes, that is the case. But of course, there is some significant sort of El Nino effect as well that's evident. But nonetheless, even without the El Nino, what we're seeing is a very, very clear trend in rising emissions and rising temperatures. So what we're seeing at the moment is in line with what our science is telling us.
And I'm struck as a layperson who happens to pay fairly careful attention to the scientific literature on climate change. The number of instances in which the rapidity of climate change and the severity of its effects appear to have been underestimated by the scientific community. Do you agree that the scientific community has tended to underestimate the rapidity of global warming and the severity of effects? And if so, why do you believe that has happened?
Well, I think we have to be quite careful about understand what is science. Science is innately a very conservative institution. We cannot always work with the very latest data. That understanding has to go through a process of peer review, and that's quite a lengthy process. So we're always working with data really that's a little bit out of date. It's from the last few years. And scientists innately are, or the scientific process is innately conservative. And because emissions have just continued to keep rising, what we have continued to see are impacts and levels of growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that are higher than we had previously anticipated, because we are innately a conservative structure. That is rightly the case. That's how science should act. The problem with climate change is that we have to respond so quickly that the time frame within which we're dealing with the science is actually not compatible really with how fast our responses need to be, which has been a dilemma for scientists, because do you therefore come out and start to talk about the very latest data before you've really had a chance with your colleagues to peer review and scrutinise it, which would normally take quite a few years. But that's what, of course, the policy realm requires, that level of engagement. But that's not how we've worked as scientists historically. So it's quite a difficult challenge for us now to reconcile those two positions. Nevertheless, I think we have to be a little bit more careful in how we actually relate what it is that we discover in the science and what we know is at the very cutting edge of research, because, as you say repeatedly, we've underestimated what's happening in terms of levels of concentration in the atmosphere, the changes in temperature, and so forth.
And if the global community were to fulfill the emission reduction targets, the various signatories to the Paris Accord have exceeded, what is the science telling us we're going to experience in terms of global warming in the years ahead?
Well, if we deliver on the promises that were made into Paris, then really we're talking about a 3 to 4 degrees C temperature rise across the century. So remember, this is what governments put together, saying this is the best ambition that we could imagine. They submitted that into Paris, and when you add all of those together, what that comes to is a 3 to 4 degrees C rise. And yet, collectively, of course, those same country leaders got together in Paris and said we must aim for 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. So there's this huge gap between the action that governments are prepared to make and the rhetoric that they're using at a collective forum like Paris, and this year, of course, like Marrakech. And I think it's the job there for the scientists to try to sort of say this is not good enough. Let's be honest. Either let's be really clear and say we're going to bequeath our children and future generations and those living in poor and climatically vulnerable parts of the world a really catastrophic future in terms of 3, 4, 5 degrees C temperature rise, or let's be honest and say we will start to make the dramatic changes that we need in our energy system, in how we use energy today, in the lifestyles of those of us that are responsible for the lion's share of emissions that are going into the atmosphere. We're prepared to make those sorts of changes. At the moment, we almost want our cake and eat it. We will pretend to be doing something significant whilst at the same time just carrying on with business as usual.
Mm-hmm. And in the country that I come from, in Canada, one of the ways in which the governments, both at the federal and the provincial level, particularly the provincial level, and here I'm thinking mostly about the province of Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are oil-rich provinces and have aggressively sought to develop their tar sands deposits. One of the ways in which they talk about meeting their obligations under the Paris Accord is negative emissions, and particularly carbon capture technology. And I just want to read to you a statement from the Saskatchewan Minister of the Environment, Scott Moe, who is coming to COP22 this year. He said, "Our commitment to carbon capture and storage technology and our aggressive move towards renewable electrical generation technologies are two key planks in our strategy." You, however, with Gary Peters in an article that was published on October 15th of this year, had this to say: "Negative emission technologies are not an insurance policy, but rather an unjust and high-stakes gamble. There is a real risk that they will be unable to deliver on the scale of their promise. If the emphasis on equity and risk aversion embodied in the Paris Agreement are to have traction, negative emission technologies should not form the basis of the mitigation agenda." What currently is proven in terms of negative emission technologies, and what role is expectations or hopes around negative emission technologies playing in the efforts of countries, or the purported efforts of countries, to meet their obligations under under the Paris Accord?
Well, disturbingly, what we're seeing in the Paris Accord, and indeed really that underpins most government policies, is a belief, and that of course is all it is at the moment, a belief that very large levels of negative emission technologies will work, and they will start to work very soon as well, as early as the mid-2020s to 2030, and then the assumption is that these will be rolled out across the rest of the century. Let's be clear here, we're not just locking this in for the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. We're talking about carrying on these negative emission technologies well beyond the end of the century. Within the guidance that the government ministers are receiving from these integrated assessment models, as they're called, significantly dominated by economists, that advice is assuming we will be removing from the atmosphere the same amount of carbon dioxide as the oceans do today. And by the end of the century, that will be removing as much as the oceans and the plants do today. So that's the equivalent of having another biosphere, like another planet, actually alongside ours, that would remove the carbon dioxide that we have not been prepared to remove by changing our high carbon activities today. So that's the level of assumption that's in there. You then look at how well are we developing these technologies? Currently, at best, there are 1 or 2 very small pilot plants that are operating. And these are already struggling to operate as well efficiently. Most of the work on the negative emission technologies is still in the laboratory or on pieces of paper in terms of sort of conceptual diagrams. That's about as far as we have so far got in terms of these technologies. And yet the assumption is these will be rolled out starting within the decade at very large scale. I think it's worth looking within Canada. I mean, you've got the Boundary Dam experiment, because that's of course what it is. And they've been testing with carbon capture and storage, and that has proved itself incredibly challenging. They've had a lot of technical problems with it. It's probably only captured about 40% of the carbon dioxide or so that it should have captured. And of course, that carbon dioxide has then been used to enhance oil recovery, so it's not been particularly good for the climate anyway. So the basic technologies and the parts of the puzzle themselves actually are not working well at the moment. So the very naive assumption that these will roll out in the future, I think, is dangerous, and we are using it to maintain the status quo today, so we can carry on burning fossil fuels, so we can carry on living the lifestyles that we have today. And the view that Glenn and I have on this is that whilst we should research negative emission technologies, to assume they work is actually a moral hazard. And that is our concern, is that we are reducing our mitigation challenges today because we are relying on this highly speculative technology tomorrow.
And how well do you think leaders in the Western world, in particular in high emitting, not just in the Western world, but in high emitting jurisdictions, understand the extent to which assumptions about negative emissions are built into the advice they're receiving about mitigation and about emission reduction strategies?
Well, I'm aware that a few policymakers, and when I say a few, I mean a very few policymakers, actually are aware that negative emission technologies are underpinning a lot of the advice they're receiving from the experts. But then if you ask those small group of policymakers that are aware of that, do you have any idea of the scale of negative emissions that are assumed? Virtually none of them, if any of them, will have any idea of that scale. Indeed, a lot of the scientists working on climate change are shocked when you tell them the level of negative emissions that are assumed in the models that we are using to advise governments. So many of us that work in climate change have been very surprised to understand this. It's almost like this hidden agenda that's within the models. So I'm certain that the policymakers have no conceptual grasp of the scale and the rollout of negative emissions that are assumed in the advice that they are receiving.
Mm-hmm. Now, last year at COP21, you did manage to attend that climate conference, and on the last day, I had the pleasure of hearing you and several other leading climate scientists offer an assessment on the final or the penultimate draft of the accord. And your comments struck me for a number of reasons. And I'd like to just revisit what you had to say that day. Let's listen to what your comments were.
I do not think peaking emissions as soon as possible is scientifically robust, sufficiently robust, and there is no reference to the levels of those peaks. There is no reference to fossil fuels in the document, despite the fact for 1.5 to 2 degrees C, we really need to be keeping around about 90% of all current reserves in the ground. The language of neutrality masks the ruse that we have developed, or the assumptions we have, that we will be able to suck very large quantities of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the future, and that means we do not have to have such significant reductions in the near term. That also means without those negative emissions, 1.5 degrees C is not viable. Some people would argue that the current text is described as practical. I've heard that already, that it's a manifesto for green growth, for win-win. But to whom is it practical? It may be practical to those of us here, wealthy high emitters in the Northern Hemisphere. To the poor, climatically vulnerable, non-whites, typically non-whites living in the Southern Hemisphere, the current text is somewhere between dangerous and deadly. There's a slight risk that the document as it is appeasement to our desire to continue to use fossil fuels, to a business as usual model, rather than something that is perhaps more a progressive agenda for humanity.
The first question I have for you, Kevin, is that in your commentary, you seem to raise serious questions about whether the temperature limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius was realistically achievable. And a year later, a year beyond the Paris Accord, what do you think our prospects are for remaining within that limit? And furthermore, what do you believe our prospects are for remaining even within the 2 degrees Celsius limit, particularly in light of the election of someone who I think we can fairly describe as a climate change denialist to the presidency of the United States?
Right, let's just focus in on 1.5 degrees centigrade. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has given us a set of carbon budgets, how much carbon dioxide we can emit across the century, to hold that 1.5 degrees C temperature threshold. There are, like all good science, there are uncertainties in the absolute levels of those carbon budgets. Nevertheless, somewhere between, say, 5 to 10, at the very outside 15 years, we would have used up all of that carbon budget. So I think it is fair to say that given that we are not going to review significantly the pledges made by the countries to Paris between 2018 and actually the major check is in 2023, which would be 300 billion tons of carbon dioxide away from now, I think it's fair to say that the chances of staying to 1.5 are somewhere between incredibly low and zero. The only hope you would have is if these highly speculative negative emission technologies turn out to work and that we can roll them out at very significant scale. I think that is a very dangerous assumption. That's nevertheless, as I said before, I think we should research them. But I think to assume that we're going to hold to 1.5, particularly as at the moment no country really is demonstrating any leadership on climate change, I think it is dangerous to assume that we will hold to that temperature threshold. I understand why some of the poorer countries, particularly the low-lying, some of the low-lying nations in the southern hemisphere, some of the small island states and so forth, are really very vexed about this issue. To them, 1.5 degrees C means the loss of their habitat. They are going to suffer very severely, even at 1.5. So I can see why they really want the global community to deliver on that. I just think that we have left it so late. We've had 25 years now since the first IPCC report, and we've abjectly failed. The emissions this year will be 60% higher than they were when we first had the IPCC report in 1990. We've used up the carbon budget, and I think 1.5 degrees C is, in any scientific sense, no longer viable. I think there's a little bit more hope for 2 degrees centigrade because the carbon budgets are bigger. But I think even there, a high chance of 2 degrees centigrade now is really very unlikely unless we were prepared at a global level to approach climate change almost as if we had a war footing, that every country would move and mobilize its industries to start building very low carbon power stations, to have massive levels of electrification, huge changes in energy use, effectively rationing energy use in the short to medium term to control emissions. No country is demonstrating anything along those lines, let alone collectively at a global level. So I think unless something changes almost immediately, then we have forgone a reasonable chance of 2 degrees centigrade. The best chance we're really aiming for now is at best 50-50, more likely an outside chance of 2 degrees, which I'd like to make a comparison with if you were to fly somewhere, would you accept a 50-50 chance of it landing safely? Or at the moment, probably, I think, only a 30% chance of it landing safely. We wouldn't, but we are prepared to do that with our children's future on this planet. So 2 degrees C, I think, remains viable as an outside chance. But even for that, we would need dramatic changes. The two things we would require is literally a Marshall-style plan, like the reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War, in terms of building low-carbon energy supply, electrification, and dramatically changing our infrastructure to be very low carbon and very low energy use. But that in itself would not be enough. We also require to reduce emissions dramatically in the short term to extend the window of opportunity for building that new infrastructure. And to reduce energy consumption means that those of us responsible for the lion's share of emissions would have to cut or change our lifestyles. It's really important to realize that 50% of global carbon dioxide emissions, around 50%, come from only 10% of the global population. If that 10% were to reduce their emissions to the level of the average European citizen, so really not even a dramatic change, that would reduce global emissions by about a third. It just shows you this huge asymmetry, that the responsibility for emissions going into the atmosphere significantly resides with a relatively small proportion of the population. The problem is that small proportion of the population are all those people at COP and people like myself. There are those of us who are engaged in the policy realm. There are those of us who actually will make the new rules on climate change. And we seem to be reluctant to make rules that mean that people like us will have to change our lifestyles. And so we continually rely on other forms of scams, whether that's offsetting the clean development mechanism, weak trading rules, or now we've got the negative emission technologies. It's never real mitigation. Almost every single country, we have failed on real mitigation. And going back to Canada, Canada has very high emissions. I'm coming from Sweden with emissions of about 4.5 tons per person. Canada runs at about 16 or so tons per person. If you look at Saskatchewan, I think it's near 50 to 60 tons per person. So, across the western part of the world, there are huge differences in emissions, and we're not even prepared to start to make big changes that are evident using existing technologies and existing examples that we can see across different countries today.
You mentioned the case of Canada, Kevin, and one of the things one often hears in Canada when people talk about the responsibility of our country to rise to the occasion in terms of battling the climate crisis is that total emissions in Canada are dwarfed by those of the major emitters, and the case of China is constantly raised. and therefore we can't make much of a difference, and we don't bear much of a responsibility because global total emissions coming out of China are so far in excess of those in Canada. How would you respond to that argument?
Well, I would always think it's not really an argument. We use it as an excuse for inaction today. The UK emissions are not that dissimilar to those of Canada, around about 2%. Aviation emissions around about 2%. Shipping emissions around about 2%. Germany emissions around about 2%. California emissions 2 to 3%. Beijing and Shanghai add them together about 2%. You can split the world up into 52% and then argue that every single of those 2% has no effect. But that, of course, 50 times 2 takes you to 100%. It is no argument for Canada to say that its emissions don't matter, because you can always divide the world up like that if you want to, but it gets you, of course, nowhere. And of course, historically, Canada was much more responsible relative to the size of its population than many of the other poor parts of the world. So Canada has a real responsibility, as does the UK, as do other countries that have historically been responsible for climate change, and for the last 25 years have done so knowingly. We have responsibility to demonstrate by leadership to bring our emissions down. But in addition, the emissions per capita in places like China, places like Canada or the UK and the wealthy parts of the world are far above those of the poorer parts of the globe. And indeed, although people start to say China's emissions are rising, that's significantly because they are making the computers for Canadian people. They are making the computers that I'm talking to you through right at this moment. So they make our equipment, our clothes. So much of the manufactured world is made by these poor parts of the world, using relatively inefficient energy systems quite often, and then we complain that their emissions are high. We again are expected to have our cake and eat it. We are finding every excuse for inaction. And Canada, of course, is a major producer, as is the UK, of fossil fuels. And indeed, Canada is now trying to pursue what is probably the dirtiest of fossil fuels in relation to tar sands. So I think it's morally irresponsible to argue that Canada has no significant responsibility in relation to climate change. It has responsibility historically, it has responsibility in terms of demonstrating leadership, and actually its emissions do matter.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us today, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk to you in the near future about what hopefully will be progress in terms of confronting the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Good afternoon.
Thank you. And this is Dimitri Lascaris for the Real News from Marrakech, Morocco, and COP22.